In this video, I'm going to be discussing the main differences between the presidential and parliamentary democracies that exist around the world. I'm going to be using the United States as an example of the presidential model and the UK as the example of the parliamentary model. First, you see I've written down some notes already. Things that you should already know about the presidential system is that it is two agencies. We like to call these agencies branches in the United States, and that is our legislative and executive branch. They operate separately in terms of creating policy. Now, moving on to the parliamentary side, the two branches, legislative and executive branches in the UK, are interdependent. Another term that you might hear is they are fused. So this is a basic description of the two types of democracies. Moving back to the presidential side, we have the separation of powers. This is unique to the presidential democracy. We do not see a separation of powers between the legislative and executive branches. On the parliamentary side, this is just on the presidential side. Now, the American founding fathers were very particular about having this piece in our democracy in the United States, pretty much because they really wanted to prevent injustices from occurring. They were, obviously used to having the monarchy in Great Britain, and hence the reason why the American Revolution occurred. And so they wanted to make sure that if you have a legislative branch that becomes corrupt and tries to take over, you have a separate branch, the executive branch, that can put them back into place, and vice versa. So this is very unique to the presidential model. Moving down a little bit further, we know that in the United States there is a combined roles within the chief executive. In the presidential system, we have a president, and they are combined, meaning that the president in the United States represents the head of government and the head of state. Moving over to the parliamentary system, that actually changes. Their prime minister or PM only represents the head of government. Now, their head of state is actually going to be whoever sits at the head of the monarchy, and that'll be explained in a later video. So moving down, when we talk about the chief executive, we need to explain the main difference between the two sides. So let's start with the presidential. In terms of the selection, the president is directly elected. In the US, they are elected by the Electoral College. This is unique to the United States. Now, moving over to the parliamentary side, the prime minister, only the legislative branch is directly elected. Once the legislative branch has their elections, they actually will then choose the prime minister. So it's a little bit of a different setup, hence the reason why we talk about the parliamentary side being fused. In order for the legislative branch to choose the PM, it has to come from the prime minister has to come from the majority party. So whichever party wins the majority in parliament in this example, then chooses their leader, and that leader will serve as the prime minister. They do vote for that prime minister, but only the majority party does the voting. So here you have only the legislative branch being directly elected by the people, whereas within the United States we directly elect both our legislative branch and our executive branch. Now, in terms of removal, over in the United States, there are fixed terms. What that means is it would be a lot harder for removal of the president. We do have impeachment in the U.S., but that means that the president has to do something illegal. There's no other way to get rid of a president during their term, besides if they commit an illegal act. Now, moving over to the parliamentary side, there are a couple of ways that the prime minister can be removed, as well as the legislative branch being removed. And so we'll start with the prime minister. There can be a vote of no confidence. And now what that means is basically if the prime minister has angered any of the members of parliament or has gone down a line that no longer aligns with the majority party, the prime minister will be subject to his majority party calling on a vote of no confidence, which basically says we're going to have a vote and decide whether or not a majority of the legislative branch is still confident in your power. And so that is the main way that the prime minister can be removed. Now, if the majority of the people vote that they are confident in the prime minister, then the prime minister will stay in power. But unfortunately, if the prime minister does not win a majority, then they will not stay in power and will have to run for re-election. Now, in this system, the legislative branch also is subject to removal because the prime minister can call an early election. And so basically, because of the interdependence between the two, they both have to figure things out and get along, or either one can call for either an early election coming from the prime minister or the legislative branch having a vote of no confidence. Whereas when we move back over to the presidential side, both of the parties have 2 terms. So this applies for legislative and executive, and I meant to say that they have fixed terms, meaning that the legislative branch in the Senate, they serve for 6 years. The House of Representatives serves for 2 years, and the president serves for 4 years. So those are fixed terms unless any of these members commit an illegal act. All right, moving down to legislative power. Both the legislative and executive branches have legislative powers in a presidential system. Meaning, in terms of setting policy, for the most part, we have the legislative branch that creates the laws. But because of our system of checks and balances, we also have the president who is able to veto, and he can also propose laws. So both branches have pretty equal power in terms of legislative power, but mainly with the legislative branch being responsible for the creation of the laws in the United States. Now, moving over to parliamentary system in terms of legislative power, only the legislative branch has the ability to create laws, make laws within the system. So we would not have a prime minister who's able to veto any type of legislation. And really, the main reason for this is that you have to remember the Prime Minister is the member of the majority party. So, generally speaking, because the Prime Minister is chosen from the majority party, that Prime Minister is not going to disagree with the laws that are put into place by the majority party within Parliament. All right, moving down just a little bit. For our last piece is just the relationship between the legislative and executive branches in both systems. On the presidential side, there can be different parties in the two branches. And so what that means for a presidential system is that there's going to be less cohesiveness. Because you can have a president that is a Democrat, and you can have the legislative branch, either the House of Representatives or the Senate, that is Republican. And so because of that, there's a lot more opportunity for divisiveness and lack of compromise in a presidential system. Moving over to parliamentary system, basically, because of the fact that the Prime Minister is being elected from the majority party, both the, oops, sorry, a little error there, let me just erase that. Okay, sorry about that. We know that both the legislative and executive branch are from the same parties. And so what that does for this type of democracy is lends itself to cohesiveness. Rarely will you see the Prime Minister disagreeing with the majority party because he, in fact, is a leader and member of that party. And so that wraps up our discussion of the main differences between the presidential and parliamentary system. Thank you.